They did not merely suggest that she step down, they did not issue a polite, bureaucratic request for her resignation wrapped in the usual diplomatic plastic of the European Union. Instead, they did something far more damaging to a leader of her stature: they laughed. It wasn't a nervous titter or a localized jeer. It was an open, raucous, and mocking roar that echoed off the high-arched ceilings of the chamber, broadcast in high definition to tens of millions of people across an entire continent already simmering with a quiet, lethal resentment. There stood the most powerful woman in Europe, a figure who had spent decades meticulously crafting an aura of untouchable, technocratic efficiency. At that microphone, under the unforgiving glare of the studio lights, her hands, usually steady enough to navigate the most treacherous geopolitical waters, were visibly shaking. Her voice, a tool she had used to command summits and silence domestic critics, was breaking. For the first time in her career, the veil of authority had been torn away by the very people who were constitutionally bound to respect the office she held. They laughed directly at her face, and in that sound, the weight of her legacy began to shatter in real time. Within the same hour, the cold, grey pavement of Brussels was being smothered by the boots of 50,000 citizens. They did not arrive with the coordinated banners of a political party or the pre-printed signs of a funded non-governmental organization. They arrived with the raw, jagged energy of a people who had reached a collective breaking point. The number was not static, it was a living, growing organism, climbing by the thousands as words spread through digital networks faster than any official response could be drafted. There are singular moments in the grand tapestry of human history that arrive without the courtesy of a warning. History usually offers a drumroll, a dramatic buildup of leaked intelligence, a series of whispered threats circulating through the dark back channels of intelligence agencies, or a slow-motion car crash of policy failures. But this was different. This was the kind of moment that simply detonates while the rest of the world is still going through the mundane motions of a Tuesday morning. It was a flash of lightning in a clear blue sky. By the time the political elite understood the gravity of what they were witnessing, the event had already transitioned from a protest into a transformation, and it was already too late for the establishment to look away. The European Parliament chamber in Strasbourg is a place designed to project permanence, order, and the inevitable progress of the European project. On that specific morning, it became a vacuum of history. This is the kind of day that historians return to again and again, dissecting the footage frame by frame to find the exact second the equilibrium shifted. They will not just look to describe the sequence of events, they will be searching for the fundamental how. How does something so complete, so total, and so utterly irreversible unfold with such terrifying speed in front of the entire world? How is it that with thousands of staffers, security details, and strategists on the payroll, absolutely nobody was able to stop the momentum once it started? Ursula von der Leyen had arrived at the chamber at precisely 10:15 in the morning, Central European Time. She moved with the rhythmic, practiced confidence of a leader who believed her position was a fact of nature. She was flanked by a security detail that functioned like a human shield, her senior advisors moving in a tight, protective orbit around her, whispering the final adjustments to the day's strategy. In her hand, she carried a leather folder containing her prepared remarks, carefully crafted talking points, vetted by a dozen committees, designed to sanitize any conflict and navigate the predictable friction of the session. She wore the expression she had perfected over decades at the highest levels of European politics: composed, confident, and slightly distant. It was the look of a leader who had faced pressure before and survived it every single time. She had absolutely no reason to believe this morning would be any different from the thousands of mornings that had preceded it. In her mind, she was invincible. She had survived budget crises that threatened to tear the Eurozone apart, she had weathered the storms of pandemic criticism, she had outlasted diplomatic failures and opposition campaigns that had thrown everything they had at her and still come up short. She had built a reputation as someone who bent but never broke, someone who absorbed pressure like a sponge and kept moving forward. That reputation, however, was about to be destroyed in a way she never saw coming and could never have prepared for. The chamber was filled beyond its normal capacity, every seat taken by a representative who seemed to know something the president did not. Every camera was positioned and ready. Veteran journalists who had covered European parliamentary proceedings for years described the atmosphere that morning as unlike anything they had felt in that building before. It was not the normal tension of a contested vote or a difficult policy debate. It was something deeper, something that felt less like politics and more like a reckoning that had been building for a very long period and had finally, with no further warning, arrived. The air in that room carried the weight of years of frustration, years of grievance, and years of carefully managed anger that had finally run out of room to be contained. Nobody could have named exactly what was coming, but everyone in that chamber felt at the moment they walked through those heavy doors. The session opened with the agonizingly slow tempo of standard procedural formalities. The chamber president called the meeting to order, and the agenda was read aloud in a monotone that suggested another day of dry legislative work. Everything on the surface appeared exactly as it should, maintaining the illusion of a functioning bureaucracy. And then the first strike landed. It did not come from where anyone expected. It did not come from the populist opposition bloc that had spent years publicly attacking her leadership at every opportunity. It did not come from the far right or the Eurosceptics or any of the political forces that had made careers out of opposing everything the Commission under her leadership represented. It came from a German member of the European Parliament, a representative from her own political family. This was a man who, by every definition of the word, was supposed to be her ally, her defender, and one of the people standing between her and the forces that wanted her gone. He rose from his seat, and the moment his voice filled that chamber, every single person in the room understood that something historic and irreversible had just begun. He spoke with the controlled fury of someone who had rehearsed every single word but felt every syllable with genuine, deep, and unmanageable conviction. He said he could no longer in good conscience remain silent about what he described as the catastrophic failures of the current Commission leadership. He said the European Union had become a laughingstock on the global stage. He said that decades of carefully constructed diplomatic credibility, relationships built over generations, and alliances forged through crisis and sacrifice had been incinerated in a matter of weeks through arrogance, detachment, and breathtaking incompetence. He said the citizens of Europe were suffering in ways that were real, measurable, and devastating, while the leadership in Brussels remained completely and willfully disconnected from the reality that ordinary people were living every single day. His voice never broke, it never rose to a shout. It stayed controlled, deliberate, and surgical. And that control made it more devastating than any outburst could ever have been. Then he said the words that detonated the entire chamber. He said, Ursula von der Leyen must resign immediately for the good of Europe. The reaction was instantaneous and total. Half the chamber erupted in thunderous applause that shook the walls and rattled the bones of every person in that room. The other half sat in stunned, suffocating silence, unable to comprehend the betrayal they had just witnessed. Von der Leyen's face went visibly pale. Her hands gripped the edge of her desk until her knuckles turned white. The cameras were already moving, closing in to capture every flicker of shock and every trace of panic crossing her features in real time for an audience of millions who were only just beginning to understand what they were watching. But this was only the very beginning of what that chamber had prepared for her. Because within seconds of that first demand landing, the second strike was already incoming, and it was far worse than the first. A French representative was on her feet before the applause had even reached its peak. She did not speak in generalities or traffic in broad accusations that could be deflected. She came with specifics. She talked about the diplomatic catastrophe with the United States and the complete and humiliating refusal of the American administration to even acknowledge European leadership at the highest levels of international negotiation. She described the utter degradation of watching decades-old alliances that had guaranteed European security and relevance since the end of the Second World War, crumble because of what she called incompetent, arrogant, and deeply irresponsible handling of critical negotiations. She accused von der Leyen directly and without a single moment of hesitation of single-handedly destroying the transatlantic relationship that an entire generation of leaders had dedicated their careers to building. The applause grew louder, and the energy in the chamber shifted from shock to momentum. And momentum, once it reaches that level in a room like that, does not stop on its own. Then the Italian representative rose. He did not wait for formal recognition from the chair. He simply began speaking, his voice cutting through the noise with the raw edge of someone who had finally run out of patience. He talked about the economic devastation sweeping across his country in waves that showed no sign of stopping. He spoke of factories shutting their doors permanently, and unemployment numbers climbing to levels that were destroying entire communities and tearing families apart. He spoke of small businesses collapsing under the suffocating weight of regulations designed in Brussels by bureaucrats who had never once run a business, never struggled to make payroll at the end of a difficult month, and never watched the work of a lifetime disappear because of a policy decision made by someone sitting in a comfortable office thousands of kilometers away from the consequences. He said Italian workers were desperate and that young people were leaving the country because they saw no future at home. And the person responsible for the policies driving that suffering, he said, was standing right there in that chamber, hiding behind a folder of prepared remarks and a wall of carefully practiced excuses. By this point, the chamber was in full revolt. One by one, representatives from Poland, Hungary, the Netherlands, Austria, and Spain rose from their seats to deliver their verdicts. The language they used was not parliamentary in any traditional sense. It was brutal and direct. It was the language of people who had stopped calculating political consequences and started speaking raw, unfiltered truth. They talked about financial mismanagement on a scale that bordered on criminal. They talked about authoritarian overreach that had corroded the democratic foundations the European Union was built upon. They talked about a fundamental betrayal of the values and the promises that had given the European project its moral authority in the eyes of the world. Each speaker fed off the energy of the one before, escalating the attacks and raising the temperature until the confrontation reached levels that even the most cynical veterans in that building said they had never witnessed. Through all of it, von der Leyen sat at her desk, her composure cracking piece by piece under the weight of an assault she had no prepared response for. She raised her hand and attempted to interject, requesting the floor from the chamber president, but she was at first simply ignored. This was a humiliation of historic proportions for a sitting commission president, to be treated as an invisible bystander in her own parliament. When she finally reached that microphone and opened her mouth to respond, what happened next was something that nobody in that room will ever forget. As she tried to justify the decisions of the past months, the laughter began again, higher, louder, and more pervasive than before. It was the sound of a power structure losing its grip. But while she fought for her survival at that microphone, the part that changes everything was happening outside those walls. What erupted in those streets, the tears of a nurse from Leyen speaking into a camera about the inability to afford heat, the silence of the shops in Rome, none of this disappears when the cameras turn off. None of it gets quietly buried in a news cycle and forgotten by next week. The rage that filled the streets of Brussels was not manufactured, it was not organized by opposition parties with funding and agendas. It was real, spontaneous, and it is still there, burning in every city and every town. Ursula von der Leyen walked into that chamber as the most powerful woman in Europe, but she walked out as something else entirely. The institution she led and the entire architecture of European authority she represented walked out changed, too. It was damaged in ways that cannot be repaired with a press statement or a carefully managed public appearance. The world watched, the world recorded it, and the world is still watching to see what happens next. The truth that nobody in power wants to say out loud is that when 50,000 people flood the streets without being called, something is already broken that cannot be fixed by the same hands that broke it. This story is moving faster than anyone is prepared for, and the conversation happening in the kitchens and workplaces across the continent is only just beginning. As the afternoon sun began to dip behind the jagged skyline of Strasbourg, the atmosphere inside the European Parliament did not settle into its usual post-session quiet. Instead, the hallways hummed with a frantic, electric anxiety. Staffers in expensive suits hurried between offices with a look of pale-faced terror, clutching smartphones that were vibrating non-stop with alerts from every major capital. The digital world was on fire. The video of the laughter, that brief, sharp moment where the facade of the Commission president finally cracked, had already been viewed over 100 million times. It was being remixed, shared, and discussed in languages from across the globe. It wasn't just a political defeat, it was a cultural collapse. The image of the mother of Europe shaking at a podium while her own peers mocked her had become the definitive meme of a failing era. In the backrooms, the talk was no longer about policy or the next legislative session. It was about survival. The von der Leyenism that had defined the last decade, a blend of centralized command, distant technocracy, and a refusal to acknowledge dissent, had hit a wall of reality that was simply too thick to penetrate. Outside, the crowd in Brussels had not dispersed. As the sun set, the glow of thousands of smartphone screens lit up the night like a field of artificial stars. They stayed. They brought food, they brought blankets, and they brought a resolve that terrified the security forces watching from behind the reinforced glass of the Commission buildings. This was the nightmare scenario the elite had whispered about for years, a spontaneous, leaderless uprising of the middle class. These weren't the usual radicals, these were the teachers, the mechanics, the nurses, and the small business owners. These were the people who paid the taxes, followed the rules, and had finally realized that the rules no longer worked in their favor. The air was cold, but the energy was white-hot. Every time a new clip from the Strasbourg chamber was played on the giant portable screens erected by the protesters, a roar went up that could be heard blocks away. It was the sound of a collective awakening. Back in Strasbourg, the president's inner circle was reportedly in a state of total paralysis. For years, they had relied on the Brussels bubble, a protective layer of sycophants and favorable media coverage that filtered out the harsh realities of the continent. They had convinced themselves that the anger of the populace was just noise or misinformation that could be managed with better communication strategies. But you cannot communicate your way out of a laughing parliament and a city under siege. You cannot message your way out of the fact that people can no longer afford the life the Union promised them. As the night wore on, the first calls for a vote of no confidence began to circulate through the digital channels of the parliament. It wasn't just the opposition anymore, it was the moderates, the centrists, and the very people who had been the foundation of her power. They saw the writing on the wall, and they were scrambling to get on the right side of history before the ink dried. The fallout was not limited to Europe. In Washington, the State Department was holding emergency briefings. In Beijing and Moscow, the state media was replaying the footage of the Strasbourg scandal with glee, using it as proof that the Western liberal order was in its final, chaotic throes. The transatlantic relationship, already strained to the breaking point by the failed negotiations mentioned by the French representative, seemed to be evaporating in real time. The world was witnessing the decapitation of European leadership, not by a foreign invader or a military coup, but by the weight of its own hubris. The laughter in that room had been a signal to the rest of the planet that the center was no longer holding. By the early hours of Wednesday morning, the situation had reached a fever pitch. The Italian representative's speech about economic devastation had touched a nerve that had been raw for a generation. It wasn't just Italy, it was the realization that the entire economic model of the Union, built on cheap energy, globalized supply chains, and the suppression of national sovereignty, was failing simultaneously. The bureaucrats who had never run a business were being called to account by the people who kept the world running. The nurse from Leyen, whose video had gone viral alongside the president's, became the face of the movement. She didn't talk about GDP or fiscal multipliers, she talked about the look in her children's eyes when she told them they couldn't have the heat on. She talked about the arrogance of the leather folder von der Leyen had carried into the room, filled with words that meant nothing to a woman who couldn't buy milk. The irreversible nature of the day became clear when the mainstream media, which had spent years protecting the Commission's image, began to pivot. Seeing the tide turn, the anchors and pundits who had previously dismissed critics as populists began to ask tough questions about the president's future. It was the ultimate betrayal of the establishment, the guards were joining the revolution. The narrative had shifted from will she survive, to who will replace her, and finally to what comes after the Union. The architecture of authority had not just been damaged, it had been desanctified. The aura of the Brussels elite, that intangible quality that allows a small group of people to rule over hundreds of millions, had evaporated. And once that aura is gone, it can never be reconstructed. As Wednesday dawned, the streets of Brussels were still full. The 50,000 had become 80,000. The atmosphere was no longer one of protest, but of a new, uncertain beginning. The world watched, recorded, and waited. The conversation happening at kitchen tables across the continent, the one the elite had ignored for so long, was now the only conversation that mattered. The most powerful woman in Europe was now a ghost in her own palace, a figurehead of a system that had been laughed out of existence by the very people it claimed to represent. The story was moving faster than anyone was prepared for, and for the first time in a century, the people of Europe were the ones holding the pen.